China in 1985, a time when China's population crisis was making headlines around the world.
In an effort to protect its people from starvation, China has enacted a policy limiting families to just one child.
I never thought much about what the policy meant for me or anyone until I learned that I was going to be a mom. None of my family questioned the policy or how it was implemented.
如果生个女儿，就那个直接放到老两那送家。
你都还是觉得计划生育好，是吧？
计划生育，还有几没有钱。啥小东西我都了，就打死那就行了，就跟打仗似的。 灭了多少人，是不
？Chinese government would come in and they'd bash down your house, take the child.
190个人在床上把做的。
我听我爸说，有个双胞胎姐姐跟我长得一模一样，现在在美国。
我手中的发现不链造假涉及全国各地。
像你还有你家是在全国做这个做的最大的吧
Throughout my life, I was taught to believe the love of my country was equal to love of the government and the party. I was so angry, even with my own family, that there wasn't more to be said or done. Everyone we spoke to said the same things about the policy.
没办法啊。 现在不现在
是他们。
抱走了那么多的小孩子，
就想帮你继续找那个双胞胎女儿的事情过来的。
哎，现在16岁了。
I wondered if most people in China really thought it was worth the sacrifices each family made.
Well, welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking about a documentary that I recently watched called One Child Nation, and it is available on Amazon Prime, so you could check that out yourself if you'd like to see it. But the topic of One Child Nation is dealing with the policy in China for a few decades that just recently ended. Was they had a one child per family policy, national policy. So here is the largest nation in the world, or at least was the largest nation in the world for a long time. I think maybe India is either approaching that or has surpassed that, but China has over 1 billion people. And during, I believe, the 70s and 80s, or around the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they implemented this one-child policy. And they did that. The central government, the communist central government, the Marxist communist central government enacted this policy in order to prevent the nation from being overpopulated. And that was the fear. Rather than allow people to make free choices and make free decisions about their own family and how big the family would be, and so on and so forth, the government imposed a one-child policy on the entire population of China. This is perhaps one of the largest central government coercive programs in the history of our planet. Imagine the ideal that here in the United States many couples have of having a boy and a girl and raising children, not just one child, but children in a family. And then there are so many benefits for raising children rather than one child because of the socialization that occurs inside the home when there are more than one child. There's more than one child. Brothers, sisters all tend to help each other develop properly in a social context so that it's not all about them. If you have a one-child situation in a home, that child tends to be the center of attention, fine. except that they get too much attention, and so everything becomes about them. So there are all kinds of advantages for having at least two children in the home, so that one child doesn't think that they're most important, and they think that everything revolves around them, and they're spoiled. They get too much attention. That can happen. That's a problem. So sociologically, there are so many problems with just imposing a one-child policy on a population. But the biggest problem is it's a human rights violation. I mean, what right does a central government have to impose on a family the limit of the family size? And this documentary goes into some of the aspects of the one-child policy. It really didn't talk in terms about the human rights, and it definitely didn't talk about the right of people under God to establish these and make decisions about the number of children in their family, or how many children they would have and how long that they would have these children, and so on and so forth. These are all God-given rights. Never before did a government in such a draconian way impose its iron-fisted will on people as what was happening under the one-child policy. Now, the documentary does bring out the fact that nowadays the generous Chinese Communist Marxist government has permitted families to now have two children. Aren't they generous? They've allowed families to have two children now. And now all of the propaganda machinery shifts from the one-child propaganda to the two-child propaganda. In fact, the documentary does show that for decade after decade, the propaganda was only have one child, two is too many, and one child is better. All this ingrained indoctrination and propaganda in the form of graphs on the walls and graffiti on the walls and posters, big posters with idealized families with a father and a mother and one child, saying one child is best and everything. All that propaganda ingrained into an entire generation of Chinese. Now the propaganda shifts to two is better than one, because two, the one child has someone to play with, and then it's better for socialization, and all of a sudden, all of the advantages of having more than one child are now being touted by the Chinese Communist Marxist government as if this has always been the case. And all of the posters with the one-child propaganda are all taken down. All of the walls that had the graffiti, one-child graffiti, all painted over. It's as if that one-child policy never existed. And that is the scary part of it, because China is taking the modern means of propaganda and technology, computer technology and digital technology and the internet, and now they're using it for their own propaganda policies, and they are able to basically control their citizens, all 1 billion of them, to bring them in line with the government policy. Now, the documentary does a good job in showing the coercive nature of this. There were testimonies in this movie. There were scenes in this movie. There were interviews in this movie where it showed that there were people going house to house in villages. It was all organized, right from the top down. It was all organized, and there were people in charge of every little village, every little city, every big city, every province, all organized down to the local level. And this one-child policy was implemented, and it was strictly adhered to. They had incentives to turn your neighbor in. If your neighbor has more than one child, you're to tell an official, you're to tell a town's officer that your neighbors have more than one child. And someone would visit that neighbor, and they would either rebuke that neighbor or fine that neighbor or limit their upward mobility in society. There would be punishments for families that had or were caught with more than one child. And there were families with more than one child, and they were punished. And sometimes, actually, the child was taken from the family. And this is one of the worst parts of this draconian policy that the Chinese government implemented on the population. This is one of the worst parts. Many children, millions of children, were taken from their homes by the government, and there was nothing the parents could do. They were taken by officers. They were taken by representatives of the one-child policy in the government, and they were sometimes they were killed, and then later they were put in a government orphanage, and then they were sold as orphans to the world market. So there were many families in the United States that were told that there are Chinese babies available for adoption for couples who would like to adopt, and that these children were either abandoned, these children were born without a mother able to take care of the child. They were given reasons that sounded legitimate. The same kind of reasons that, say, a child would be up for adoption here in the United States. Maybe the mother was a drug addict and she wasn't able to raise a child. Maybe the mother had died and the child needed a family to live with. Or maybe the woman didn't want the child but went ahead and had the child, delivered the baby, and then put it up for adoption. There are all kinds of scenarios why women would put a child up for adoption. And so the Chinese adoption agencies were telling families from different countries like the United States that there was some reason why this child was up for adoption. And so the United States families would come over, meet the child, and pay the $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 sometimes to adopt the child to the Chinese government, and they would have their child. And they were under the pretense that this child was put up for adoption by its parents in China. Well, in many cases, that is not the case. That the government, in fact, actually took that child out of a home because it had more than one child and put it up for adoption. So forcibly removed the child from the family, the Chinese family, and put it up for adoption without their consent. And so that happened many, many times. The documentary uncovers that. It exposes that. It's really a tragic part of that whole one-child policy. Also, the documentary brings out the fact that in some instances, in many instances, women were sterilized, forcibly sterilized. So in other words, women could be sterilized after their first child, and many millions and millions and millions of women went in for sterilization so they wouldn't have children, more than one child in the family. But some of them who did have more than one child in the family, had 2 or 3 children, they were forcibly taken from their homes and brought into the medical facility and sterilized against their will. And that was done under the auspices of the government and its one-child policy. So the Chinese government actually forced sterilization of millions of women in China during this one-child policy. And probably they do that now, even under the two-child policy. Remember, right now, it is permissible to have 2 children in China, but not 3, not 4. So what do they do for people that have 3 children? What do they do with people that have 4 children? Probably the same kind of measures are taken. forced sterilizations, and not only sterilizations, but in the instances, and this is another, they interviewed people who were part of this process. In the documentary, it also brings out the tragedy that when a woman who already had a baby was seen to be pregnant, there were documented cases, and this probably happened millions of times. There were documented cases where the government actually came in and forced an abortion on that woman. Actually forced the woman into a medical facility where she was given an abortion against her will. So in other words, a woman is pregnant and the government comes in and kills her baby in the womb. And not just after the baby has been born, because there are documented cases where government officials actually, eyewitness testimony, the midwives would come in a case where the woman has already had a child, so she's already met her limit of the one-child policy, and she was given birth to a baby, and then the midwife would actually strangle the child right then and there, or take the child away from the mother and never bring it back and kill the baby. That happened also. So there's all kinds of brutality taking place under this one-child policy, and this documentary exposes all of that. So you had infanticide taking place under the one-child policy. You had abortions, forced abortions taking place under the one-child policy, and you had forced sterilization taking place under the one-child policy. This is a brutal, brutal communist state that deprives men and women, mostly women in this case, but families, of their basic human rights. Now, when I was seeing this documentary, which I had known about this situation for at least 20 years, 20 or 30 years. I read about it when I was in college. Of course, it's widely known all over the world that China implemented this policy. A lot of the details of the policy were not understood. Some of the things that were done under the policy were not exposed. But now, since this one-child policy is over with, and the new two-child policy is being implemented, the one-child policy tactics and methods are being exposed. And with the world of internet and with the world of video smartphones, it's really hard to keep these secrets from being exposed. And so the documentary, the filmmaker, the producer of this documentary, which won wide acclaim at the Sundance Film Festival, the producer was actually growing up in China under this policy and was a member of a family that actually had more than one child. So they lived in constant fear of being persecuted, of being marginalized, of being penalized, fined, and it was a rough life for people. And they got their fellow citizens to spy on their other fellow citizens. They got people in the neighborhoods to turn other people in. It was really a bad, bad situation. And it still is. It still is. Let's be honest about it. A one-child policy is really bad. It's a violation of human rights. But even a two-child policy, just the fact that the government is telling families how many children they can raise, how many members of their family, this is one of the most highly controlled situations ever implemented in the history of the world. I mean, we remember back in the Bible where it talks about Pharaoh, and he decided to do away with all of the male babies. And so he went about, or actually that was, Pharaoh tried to do that and did that. And that's why Moses was hidden in the basket in the Nile River. And that's how Pharaoh's daughter was able to have a child, because she saw this basket and found the baby in the basket, and it was Moses. So Pharaoh was trying to reduce the number of male babies in among the chosen people, the Jews. And then later we had Herod try to kill the baby Messiah, and he went into Bethlehem and tried to destroy all of the children under 2 years old. And so we see a number of different government policies that had the aim of trying to kill unwanted citizens, unwanted babies, for different various reasons. Now in China, they're trying to, the pretext is population control. And they're saying, well, we just can't feed that many people. We just can't have that many people in the borders. It's going to be too much, and it will push the structures of our society too far, and we have to control it, and this is the only way we can do it. That's what a centralized communist state can do, because if you recall communism, if you've ever learned anything about it, there is no higher power than the state. The state is the highest power. There are no higher principles than the principle of the state. So whatever the state decides is good. Whatever the state decides is bad. And so they can implement this one-child policy and proclaim all around China that this is the good thing. This is the moral thing. This is the right thing to do. Why? Because the state says it is, and there is no higher power. And that's the logic of secularism and its government structure. When you have a powerful state-controlled policymaking entity, they can come up with any kind of moral principle, because if you've eliminated God and you have destroyed all religion, then there's nothing to check the unchecked power of the state. Because the worst enemy of a government is a country full of people who have a higher power as their ultimate standard and judge. And that's why secularism has to destroy religion in order to implement its power, because if you have any kind of rival power, then you're going to get resistance. But in China, evidently, there was no resistance because the Chinese people did not have a clear understanding of who God was and have a clear understanding of what God has said. They didn't have the Bible. They didn't have revelation from God. All they had was just some principles like Confucian principles, and there was no real absolute power and no absolute principles upon which to stand and resist the state. And so when the state says this is good for everyone, Chinese people went along with it, as they are largely today, except that the good news is Christianity is growing in China by leaps and bounds, and the communist government is trying to clamp down on Christianity, no doubt, because they don't like the fact that there are citizens of China who do not look to the state as the supreme highest authority. Christians, by definition, look to Christ, Jesus Christ, as Lord. And so he is number one. He is the authority. And they look to the Bible, the Word of God, to explain God's will. And they don't look to the state. And so that brings up the topic of, if you're a Christian in China during the one-child policy, or even today during the two-child policy, what should your position be toward this gross abuse of human rights? Do you resist it? Do you say, well, we're going to have as many children as the Lord God gives us, and we're going to allow God to determine how many children we have, and we're not going to bow to Caesar, in this case, the Central Party of the communist state? We're not going to bow to them. What do you do? Do you take a very stubborn approach that says, no, only God can determine how many people are in a family. Only God can determine how many children a couple will have. It is not the right of the state to impose its policies of one child or even two child on a family. And now that's correct. It is not the state's role. It's not a God-given right of the state to impose itself in these areas. But if a Christian is living in China, what does he do? Does he resist the state, or does he conform to the state? That's a good question, because Christians are having to answer that question today, even under this two-child policy. And we know now that the Christian church is seen as a threat to the communist government. Even today, one of the larger churches we've seen in the news in the past few months was simply bulldozed over. It was a very influential church, and the members just had to stand there and watch as the bulldozers and cranes basically dismantled and then destroyed and leveled their church. And that's the way the government shows that it's in charge and Christians are not. So Christians have been meeting in homes for many, many decades, all during this one-child policy. And Christians have now been able to meet in church buildings whenever the state allows it. But the state then also comes in and shuts down churches just to show that it has the power to do these things. So it's a very difficult situation. We need to pray for the Chinese Christians. Chinese Christianity is growing greatly, and it's also a very strong type of Christianity because they've had to grow amidst persecution, and they've had to grow amongst pressure, and they've had to really decide, am I going to believe or am I not going to believe? So I would highly recommend this documentary, A One-Child Nation. You can see it on Amazon Prime, and watch it, and then also pray for the Chinese Christians even today, that God would revive them and renew them and encourage them and cause that church to grow to the point where Chinese communism is actually disbanded, like we saw in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. Well, I hope that's been a helpful commentary, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.